Today we're going to be looking at the end of the Cold War, which starts with a period of time in the 1970s known as Detente, but then tensions once again escalate in the 1980s, which in a weird sort of way brings about the actual end of the Cold War. In class, we've looked at what detente is and the fact that it was a relaxation of tension, and it occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States and China, and also between countries of Western Europe and the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc. This was mostly during the decade of the 1970s. There were different reasons that we've discussed in class when we wrote notes about why there was detente during this time period. Each country had its own individual reasons, but the biggest reason overall were the fears of nuclear warfare, which had been proven to be very true with situations in Berlin over the years and also with the Cuban Missile Crisis. For the United States, the biggest things that we wanted to start pursuing in the 70s with President Nixon was the idea of realpolitik, which was a more realistic approach to foreign policy, and the idea of linkage, which is associated with that. The idea that you can link together different issues in order to achieve a desired outcome. China had its own reasons, and also there were reasons within the continent of Europe, which we've discussed in class. We've seen in class with this table different successes that detente held for all countries involved. There were some significant agreements signed during these years. However, today we're going to look at why there was limits to this detente period and why eventually it fell apart, leading to a renewed period of tension called the Second Cold War, which ended up bringing the end of the Cold War. If you look on page 157 of your Cold War book, you can see some of these reasons listed on the screen here of why there were limitations to the detente process. First of all, when it came to the arms agreements, we've discussed the SALT I Treaty, and there was work on a SALT II Treaty, even though the United States never ratified it. These agreements, it was felt by the U.S. that the Soviets were the ones who were benefiting more. Some of these limitations that were put into these terms seemed to hurt the U.S. more than the Soviet Union, so we felt resentful for that. Also, there were actions that took place in the Middle East and in Africa, which made us doubt the Soviets' intentions and proved to us that the Soviets were really no different than what they had been. We've already discussed in detail the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and in that war, it was no secret that the Soviets had assisted Egypt for a long time before it, so we knew that they were allies. However, we suspected that the Soviets knew in advance that Egypt was planning a surprise attack on the State of Israel and did nothing to stop that. And that was in clear violation to previous agreements that had been signed between the Soviets and the Americans, which stated that if there was a situation that was known in advance that could threaten world peace, that the one superpower would then inform the other and make attempts to try to resolve the situation. So in the Soviets not acting to stop the Egyptians from their planned attack on Israel, it proved to us that they were really out for their own interest in the region and therefore could not be trusted. Additionally, there were some situations going on in the continent of Africa. There was a civil war raging in the country of Angola. The Soviets were involved by helping revolutionaries that were communist in nature. And then also the Soviets and the Cubans were supporting a revolt between the country of Ethiopia and the country of Somalia in 1977. The level of involvement on the Soviets' part was quite extensive, which suggested that they were really out for expansionist aims, which was no secret ever since the Cold War began in the late 40s. The Soviets had shown expansionist tensions and tendencies in Eastern Europe and also in Asia, so it's no secret that they would act the same way here. We also had expansionist ideas, just went about it in a different way. But with these situations in Africa in the 1970s, again, it made the U.S. doubt whether or not detente was really working, if the Soviets were clearly continuing actions which would suggest expansionism rather than cooperation. Finally, there was a big disillusionment over the issue of human rights. This was brought up in the Helsinki Accords, which, if you look back in your book, on page 155 and 156, you can see the details to that agreement. That's something that we included in the table for successes. However, the third part of that Helsinki Agreement, which was called Basket Number 3, was centered around the idea of human rights. And obviously with previous Soviet actions, such as in 1968 with the Prague Spring, where the Soviets had rolled in tanks to crush that liberalization movement within that country, and in other issues, even within their own country, that the Soviets had violated clearly principles of human rights, this was something that was becoming a very big contention. President Jimmy Carter, upon entering the presidency, made this the centerpiece of his foreign policy. Carter did achieve some success in foreign policy when it came to the Camp David Accords, as we have seen earlier in class. However, with him insisting on human rights being respected throughout the world, he actually put off a lot more countries than he did to gain any improvements for human rights. For example, he tried linking different issues together to human rights. With the Soviets, this meant that he would agree to trade certain items that they desired to improve their economy, such as electronics and other consumer goods, but in exchange they would have to agree to certain human rights protections and promises. The Soviets very much resented this, along with other countries that we accused of violating human rights in Central and South America, in Africa, and all it did was to anger these countries against us because they felt, number one, it was hypocritical, and number two, that it wasn't right to link together completely unrelated issues just to try to manipulate them into respecting human rights. For many of these countries, they felt that their human rights records within their own country, such as the Soviet Union, was their own business, and it was really nothing that we should be concerned about or that we had a right to get involved with. So with this continuing disillusionment and growing anger over the human rights issue, it finally led to the collapse of Detente, along with some of these issues in the Middle East and in Africa. In the Middle East in 1979, we've also mentioned this prior in class, the Soviets invaded the country of Afghanistan. And with that action, that once again proved to us that the Soviets were not out for cooperation, that they were continuing what they had been doing all along ever since the end of World War II, which was to expand their influence, and in doing so, threaten the world peace that had been fragilely put back together since the end of World War II. Carter, who was president when this invasion took place, responded with several different steps here, as you can see. Another thing you should remember, that at the same time of this Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we had just experienced a very devastating situation in the country of Iran, where the Iranian Revolution had taken place and the U.S.-supported Shah had been kicked out and an Islamic cleric had taken his place. Following that, there was a hostage crisis that took place where American workers at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran, were taken hostage for over a year. So in the midst of all that, with this Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, I think Carter was trying to play hardball, basically, with the Soviets and to improve his image, because the situations with Iran definitely made him look very weak. So these are the things that Carter did to respond to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The work that was being done on the SALT II treaty, Carter refused to continue with or approve, and that would have been another arms agreement that would have further limited different nuclear capabilities. If you look back at 154, you can see what was included or what was going to be included in the SALT II treaty. It was never signed. Another thing, Carter decided to stop electronic exports to the Soviet Union, which was something that they desperately needed to kickstart their economy. Their economy was becoming more and more depleted and ravaged because of the continuous spending on defense and military purposes, that the consumer economy and the people of the Soviet Union were suffering. So for Carter to stop these electronic exports was devastating to what the Soviets were trying to improve within their economy. Additionally, kind of a symbolic thing, Carter forbade the U.S. athletes from participating in the 1980 Summer Moscow Games. Carter also pledged to increase defense spending, which would directly go against things like the SALT Treaty. And Carter instituted his own doctrine. We've seen that many presidents have had their doctrines throughout the Cold War, including the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, the Nixon Doctrine, and now you see here the Carter Doctrine, which said that the U.S. would become intervened if the Soviets threatened our interests in the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf is the body of water, basically, which separates the peninsula that Saudi Arabia is located on from Iraq and Iran. It's a very crucial body of water, just like other waterways that we've seen in the Middle East, such as the Straits of Tiran and the Suez Canal. And so definitely this is foreshadowing that there was going to be continued conflict in the Middle East that the superpowers would become directly involved in instead of indirectly involved in. So that doesn't, seem like a very good sign for the peace process of the Middle East. So with all of these events and Carter's very outright actions here against the Soviet Union, Detente completely collapsed and was renewed into a second Cold War in the 80s, but that was quickly brought to an end in the end of the 1980s when communism collapsed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe broke free and the Berlin Wall came down. So we'll be talking about that next. One last thing I'd like to pull your attention to, if you look to page 158 and 159 of your Cold War book, you can see the historiography and the discussion of to what extent did detente collapse and fail. There definitely were, as we've seen with the classwork activities of the success table, that there were agreements signed in the decade of the 70s which definitely improved relations in the Cold War. However, there's different points that are brought up that says that the whole idea of detente was an illusion, basically, and that underneath the surface there was still that ongoing competition and distrust between the superpowers. So I would encourage you to read the historiography and the different historians who have weighed in on the subject on 158 and 159.